word. So. Okay, so main things we're going to cover talking about emotions. First, we're going to talk about this concept that emotions have multiple components. So, again, one of these concepts, I could ask you to try to come up with a definition, and you might struggle a little bit. Something we experience every day, all the time, but can be a little bit difficult to put into words exactly what it is. But one of the things you should know about emotions is they have these multiple components, which I'll elaborate on in a little bit. Also, emotions are very distinct from moods. So they tend to have, different properties. They have some similarities, but they're also different. So we'll talk about those differences. We'll also cover some of the, neurological components that are necessary for processing emotions. The main area that's really important for regulating and processing emotions is called the limbic system. So we'll talk about some of the different parts that make up that system. And then we'll also talk about this kind of misconception that people often have that, in order to make logical, rational decisions, we should get rid of emotions. We should be kind of Spock-like and just, approach things with pure logic. It turns out that is actually not true at all. That in order to make really good decisions, we actually need emotions. They're very necessary for that decision-making process. So we'll kind of talk about that and what can go wrong whenever someone has damage to the areas of the brain that are responsible for regulating emotions that often leads to impaired decision making. So we'll kind of talk about the relationship between those two. All right, so to start, I feel like we kind of have started a pattern of doing this with all these concepts, is just trying to figure out what exactly is an emotion. I could ask you guys to come up with a definition like I often do, but this time I'll actually give you one. So an emotion, this has a pretty lengthy definition. I'll kind of break it down in just a second. But an emotion is a response to a change in the environment that includes these different components. So it has a physiological component, a behavioral component, and a psychological component. The first part of that definition says that it's a response to a change in a stimulus. So we only experience emotions whenever something happens in our environment or in the context, basically. If right now, if I gave you all a test that you weren't expecting, and I told you this is going to determine your grade for the course, I'm going to give you an exam over everything that we've covered so far. You probably might start to feel a lot of emotions. You might feel fear and panic. You might feel a little bit anger of why didn't I warn you that this was going to come ahead of time? But that would be in response to that change, that something different is happening that you weren't expecting. And then, like I said, it includes all of these different components. So if that were to happen, if I were to tell you right now, I'm going to pass out this test, it's going to determine your whole grade, it's going to have 100 questions on it, that's going to cover everything from the whole quarter, what would you be feeling? I listed some emotions, but what would those emotions feel like to you?
Happy.
What was that?
Happy.
You'd be happy?
Oh, I don't know. I just maybe not too much.
Okay. No, so if I were to actually do that, pass out the test and you felt those things like fear and anger, I assume that's what you would feel, right? Try your best to describe to me what that would actually feel like if you felt fear or you felt anger because of that.
People would feel anxiety most likely, and that'll also include clammy hands, palpitations.
Yes.
And other physical responses.
Yeah, so you'd have that physiological component, so you might start sweating, your heart rate might go up. You're going to have some of those physiological signs that you're feeling those emotions. You mentioned anxiety, so that'd be kind of the psychological component of what it feels like internally. And then in addition to that, there would be a behavioral component. So it would probably be very obvious to me immediately that all of you feel that anger and fear. Even if you don't say anything, I would probably be able to see it in your behaviors. Your facial expression would change, your posture and everything would change in a way that I could observe. So there's, these three different components. Physiological is what your body does in reaction to that emotion. The behavioral component is the part that people can observe. So that includes, facial expressions, crying, laughing. Those would be behavioral components of emotions. And then there's that psychological component, which is what you feel internally. The psychological component is sometimes called the affect. And it's also sometimes referred to as what's called a qualia. Have any of you ever heard the term qualia? maybe in like a philosophy class or something like that. So qualia is kind of, it's a general term. It doesn't just apply to emotion. Qualia is basically the part of something that you can only understand by experiencing it yourself. So if we had, like an alien come visit who had never experienced human emotions ever, we could describe to them, like this is what's happening in the brain. This is what we call these emotions. This is when people feel these different emotions. But if they've never actually felt that emotion themselves, there's going to be a big piece of that they're not going to understand. So the qualia, the psychological component, the affect, whatever you want to call it, it's that part that like you have to experience to really understand what it feels like to feel happy, to feel sad, to feel scared. It's that sort of like affective experience that's very internal and that's kind of hard to describe with words. Even if you try to describe it, that still wouldn't give someone the actual experience of feeling that emotion.
What do you do about spelling the qualia?
Qualia is Qualia. Yeah, so affect is another term for this kind of component that I'm talking about, that like internal experience of an emotion, which is honestly probably what most of us think of when we think of an emotion. Like if I ask you how you feel, in response to whatever, you're probably mostly going to be thinking of like, what it feels like to feel happy inside. You don't really notice so much like your own facial expressions because that's something that people outside of you see. You probably don't even really pay attention to the physiological component because it's so automatic, but that like affective actual feeling of an emotion is kind of what I'm talking about here. Another way to kind of understand qualia, so like I said, this is a general concept. Qualia it applies to everything we experience, not just emotion. So like if you think of, there's kind of this philosophical thought experiment of like, do we all experience colors the same way? Have you guys ever heard of that like kind of thought experiment? Like whenever, I look out in the room, I see red. To me, that red looks a very particular way, but there's no way for me to necessarily know that like the way that I see red is the same that you see red. Because we're all just putting a label on our experience, but there's no way for me to know if your internal experience is the same. So that's kind of the qualia of color, is like I can describe it, I can talk about the neurological mechanisms of what causes color, but that doesn't give me your experience of what color is like, right? So like I said, you could apply that to pretty much every experience that we have. Okay, so we've got kind of a definition of emotions. Ashley was starting to kind of list them off. So, there are lots and lots of different emotions, but researchers try to kind of like condense them down into a set of what they call basic emotions. So basic emotions are the emotions that seem to be universal across cultures, and they kind of capture like the essence of these very, sort of specific emotions that we all experience, basically. And there's a lot of debate about what should be included in this list, but I have, I think, 6 here. Yeah, 6 that are typically, pretty much agreed upon that these are at least some of the basic emotions. Some researchers add more or maybe take away 1 or 2 from here, but these are, kind of the main ones. So if I asked you, to list off all the emotion words you can think of, or if we went through the dictionary and we started trying to find all the emotion words we can think of, there would obviously be a lot more than this. But a lot of them would be basically like similes that mean basically the same thing and have a lot of overlap. So like joy, pleasure, happiness, those all mean kind of the same thing. So we put them together into this one category that we call joy. So the basic emotions are joy, sadness, disgust, anger, fear, and surprise. And then in addition to those basic emotions, we also have some social emotions, things like shame, guilt, and pride. So the basic emotions we can experience pretty much on our own, like in a vacuum, by ourselves. But typically social emotions, we need like the presence of another person, or at least like, the theoretical presence of another person in order to experience them. So things like shame, guilt, and pride are more about how we relate to other people, essentially. All right. Another thing that's sometimes included in this definition, but I left out, is this idea that all of those channels, all of those dimensions, like the physiological, the behavioral, the psychological component, that they act like in synchrony. They act together at the same time. So if you feel, one of these emotions, if you feel joy, then simultaneously that physiological, behavioral, and psychological component are all going to like shift together. They're going to change at the same time. The reason I decided to leave it out is because it's, you can think of examples when that's not true. So can any of you think of a time that maybe you feel an emotion and those three components aren't necessarily like in sync? So a time when maybe you feel an emotion and one or more of those components are kind of like out of whack with the others.
Extreme distress.
Okay, can you elaborate a little bit? Like what would be it? Like,
Like being in a, massive car wreck and, you've got family inside the car or something.
okay, yeah.
You may appear basically in shock, but internally you're experiencing a convoluted complex of emotions.
Okay, yeah. So you might have some situation that should cause like extreme fear, basically, or extreme panic, but the behavioral response probably wouldn't match up to that because from the outside, it looks like you're just sort of sitting there calmly when really you're in shock. Yeah, that's a good example, definitely. I can think of some more like sort of everyday experiences too. So that one's pretty extreme, not necessarily common. Can you think of like, okay, for example, we would typically think if you see someone crying, that's a behavioral component because it's something I can observe. What do we typically associate crying with as an emotion? Sadness, right? But can you think of times when that's not necessarily true? Yeah, so there are people who will cry even when they're happy, right? So there's this behavioral component of crying that is conveying a message that someone's sad, but they do it whenever they're actually happy. Another one I can think of is there's not necessarily a word in English that conveys this emotion, but it's sometimes called cute aggression. And other languages actually have like a single word for it. In the Philippines, they call it like gigil, I think. Gigil, I'm pretty sure. It's been a while since I've like seen the word, so I might be spelling it wrong. But yeah, so cute aggression is this experience of like whenever you see something really cute, which causes joy, there's a somewhat of a behavioral component of this like aggressive sort of violent tendency. How many of you have ever experienced this or maybe seen other people experience it? So
It's so cute, I want to squeeze it.
Yes, exactly. So you see like a puppy or a baby or something and it's so cute that you have this overwhelming feeling of like, I just want to like pinch their cheeks or like squeeze them or like do something kind of destructive or aggressive or whatever. So again, there's kind of this like mismatch between like, it seems like you're really happy, but you're acting in a way that's like aggressive or violent. I feel like my dogs get that too. Like I have two dogs and one of them is like a year older than the other. So like we got a puppy, while my dog was like a year older or whatever. And I swear my older dog experiences that gigil where she'll like see the other puppy like do something cute and she'll just like, like play attack her basically in a way that's kind of aggressive. So I took that part out of the definition just because it's not always necessarily true that those are acting in a synchronous manner. Sometimes there's this mismatch between the physiological, the behavioral, and the psychological components. Don't always necessarily match up. All right. So the basic emotions, like I said, these are emotions that seem to be experienced universally. Like it doesn't matter what culture you come from, everyone experiences those same emotions, in certain contexts or whatever. And also, it seems like there are pretty universal facial expressions that convey those emotions. So these are images taken from a database that basically, shows people expressing these different emotions. Basically each emotion has a corresponding facial expression. So happiness, we tend to, smile, like lift our lips in an upward, motion in our cheeks, expose the teeth sometimes. There's also some stuff that happens kind of around the eyes that like squint a little bit if you're giving a true, genuine smile at least. I'm not going to go through every single one, but each emotion seems to have a, kind of designated facial expression that holds pretty much across cultures. Also, some of these we exhibit from a very early age. Basically, from birth, we can show happiness and sadness in a way that's consistent, with the way that we will as an adult. Some of the other emotions, they take time for us to like develop the proper muscle movement and everything to convey those facial expressions, but some of them are, present from birth, basically. So it seems to be something kind of like biologically wired in humans that we have this ability to convey emotions through our facial expressions and to understand other people's emotions through those facial expressions as well. The use of facial expressions has actually also been used to try to like narrow down the number of basic emotions. So that list that I gave you on the previous slide is not just like arbitrary. Part of it is combing through a dictionary, trying to find overlap and similes and like narrow those down. But another approach to trying to get that list is to look at like what are the facial expressions that we are capable of making, which of those are universal across cultures, and then putting a label on those facial expressions. Let's see. Is there anything else I wanted to say about that? I don't think so. Okay. So I gave you a definition of emotions. We kind of talked about some of the different ones. So moods are very similar to emotions in some way, right? So moods are sort of this feeling that can influence our behavior in different ways and can be influenced by other things. But there is a clear difference between moods and emotions. So one of the differences is that moods tend to be longer in duration. So emotions in general are pretty short-lived. Like if you have an emotional response to a change in the environment, it might last, anywhere from like a minute to maybe 30 minutes or something like that, and then it's usually going to dissipate and you're going to go back to your kind of like baseline. But moods can last for days, weeks, even months in some cases. So they're much longer. Also, moods typically are not easily attributed to like a single cause, whereas an emotion is. So, again, if we did the scenario I talked about, I gave you this surprise test that's going to determine your grade. The emotion you feel is going to be very obviously in response to that specific event or that specific stimulus. Whereas moods, they're kind of like more ephemeral. They're not like their cause isn't necessarily obvious, and it's usually not a single thing. It's kind of a combination of multiple things. Moods also tend to be less intense than emotions. So emotions are like these really intense short bursts of feeling, whereas moods are, less intense, kind of in the background, more subconscious in the background. And moods tend to be affected a lot by our circadian rhythms, whereas emotions aren't necessarily as much. So I could have an emotional outburst about something in the morning or in the evening or late at night, but moods tend to be, they sort of fluctuate with our circadian rhythms in kind of predictable ways. And there seems to be some like cultural, again, sort of universalities to those rhythms. So when do you all tend to typically be like in your best mood? Middle of the night? All right. So we got one. You have a weird work schedule though, right? Okay.
1 p.m.
What's that?
1 p.m.
1 p.m., so like middle of the afternoon for you? Mm-hmm. How many of you are more kind of along those lines, like middle afternoonish, tend to be in a better mood? How many of you tend to be in your best mood like in the morning? A few of you? Yeah, so there are kind of these like, individual differences. We have like the night owls and the whatever what is the early one called? Early birds. It feels weird that they're both birds, so my brain was like, it can't be bird because the night owl is also a bird, but okay, yeah, so you guys get the point. So, yes, I was thinking early worm for some reason. I was like, that's not it either. My brain's not fully functioning today, but yeah. So, we've got the night owls and the early birds, and then the people who work weird schedules overnight, so then have like, really weird circadian rhythms. But in general, we have, kind of those two basic categories, and people tend to fit into one of those and like follow that particular circadian rhythm. So, okay, so you guys gave me kind of time of day that you're in the best mood. What about like throughout the week? Like what day of the week would you typically be in your best mood? Yeah.
Friday.
Yeah, Fridays, right? Friday, Saturday, you're probably going to be in a great mood. Come like Sunday night, Monday, mood is usually going to crash for most people, and then, kind of stay the same throughout most of the week and then peak again as we get towards the weekend. Again, for most people. If you have like, a weird schedule, I know like nurses, for example, who work like 3 days on, 4 days off, but that like shifts. So sometimes they're working weekends, sometimes they're not. So that might, affect it a little bit. But in general, people tend to have, higher mood towards the weekend. Okay, what about over the course of like a year? Like seasonally? Yeah. Summertime, right? So most people, again, tend to have highest like positive mood in the summertime. And, you know, a crash in mood in the wintertime. That one just is, you know, there's a pretty obvious like physical explanation for why our mood crashes in the wintertime. Does anybody know what it is?
Sunlight.
Yeah, so the lack of sunlight is probably the main contributor to that like decrease in mood that we feel in the winter. If it's really bad, it's actually called seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, which is, I think, an appropriate acronym for that. So someone who has, you know, like gets to the point where they're actually experiencing like depression in the winter, then yeah, I would get that label of seasonal affective disorder. And yeah, it comes from, you know, the days are shorter, typically in the winter, at least in the northern hemisphere where we live. And so, you know, there's less sunlight available to begin with. And then also because it's cold, we tend to spend less time outdoors. So even if there is sunlight, we're not necessarily like exposing ourselves to it. And that has huge effects on those circadian rhythms, which really affects our mood. So the point is, you know, moods are kind of affected by these more like background factors that have these really long durations, whereas emotions are these like shorter, more intense kind of bursts of feeling. Okay. All right, one of the kind of ongoing debates about emotion has to do with kind of the order of events of how those different components I talked about happen. So that physiological component, you know, a lot of times people refer to that basically as arousal, as we've talked about in this class before. It's kind of like what's your level of like your heart rate, you know, your sweating, all of that. And so the debate is basically like which of those components comes first, or what order do they happen in. I realize this picture is not like great up here on the projector. This is in your textbook though on the website, so if you like want to see it better, you can go on there. But this kind of breaks down the four main theories that try to describe, you know, this order of events. So one of the earliest theories is called the James Lange theory. And James Lange basically thought that the way that we experience an emotion is that you have like the stimulus. In this case, there's a snake that's going to cause fear. So you see the snake. According to James Lange, the first thing that's going to happen is your body is going to respond physiologically. So the very first thing that's going to happen, your heart rate is going to increase, you're going to start sweating, all those physiological parts. And then only after you've experienced that physiological component, then you feel the affective component, the actual internal fear. So according to James Lange, physiological comes first, and then the internal affective piece comes after that. There has been some support of this theory that, you know, basically says that you need that physiological component in order to actually feel the emotion. So one piece of evidence that supports that is there are people who have damage to their like sympathetic nervous system to where they don't have that physiological response. So someone who has that damage, whenever they see a snake, their heart rate isn't necessarily going to increase because they don't have, you know, their nervous system basically doesn't function to create that increase in arousal. People who have that damage also tend to have like blunted emotions. So they might still feel the fear, but it's not to the same extent as someone who has like normal, intact physiological component of the emotion. Does that make sense? So if they're lacking the physiological component, they seem unable to then actually experience the emotion. So that kind of, you know, lends some support to this theory. All right, so then, you know, the rest of these basically just like tweak that order depending on what the theory is. So the Cannon-Bard theory basically says that you have both the physiological component and the emotion happening at the same time. So you would see the snake and kind of in parallel simultaneously, you have the physiological component and the emotion. This third one, kind of similar to the Cannon-Bard, but it brings in this idea that another important part of experiencing an emotion is the label that we put on it. So it's kind of a decision almost that we make of saying, like, I'm going to call this fear, and that's part of what contributes to the actual experience of the emotion. And then the third one basically says we have that physiological response, But then we can appraise that response in lots of different ways. And depending on how we appraise it, like how we judge that response, that also determines how we feel. So, for example, like if you think of physiologically the feelings of fear and excitement, those are going to be really, really similar, right? If something scares me or if something excites me, both of those are going to get my heart rate increase. I might sweat. So the physiological response for fear and excitement are going to be very similar. But depending on how I appraise that, like if I appraise it as this is something negative or this is something positive, that's going to shift the way that I feel. If I have the increase in heart rate and I think, oh, this is positive, I'm probably going to feel excitement. But if I have the increase in heart rate and I feel negative, then I'm probably going to think like, oh, this is fearful. So I'd say main thing to take away from this slide is just this idea that there's kind of debate about the order in which those components happen. And I talked about support for the James-Lange theory, but there is also support for some of these other three. So, kind of main takeaways that it seems to be situational. It seems to be that there are some cases where the physiological component is going to come first and then the emotion. There's some cases where that order is going to be different. It kind of just depends on like the specific circumstance. I'm trying to think where this other piece fit in that I was going to have you do. So there's an experiment, I believe, that was done in support of the James-Lange theory, basically, so the idea, too, is that part of the physiological is like the facial expression and the way that we, move our muscles, essentially, and that the way we express ourselves actually affects the way that we feel. So if you've ever heard of like the concept of like fake it till you make it, kind of fits into that. So if I like force myself to smile, then that might make me feel happy, even though, internally I'm not necessarily as happy as I might look on the outside. So a study that was done to try to support that, they had participants come in, they told them some made up story about what the study was about. Like I think they said that the study was about studying like the muscles of the face and how they move. And they told half of their participants to take a pencil and hold it in their teeth. So you all can do this if you want to. But if you take a pencil and you hold it in your teeth, it kind of like forces you to smile, right? You have to expose your teeth. You have to kind of like separate your lips and raise them a little bit. They told the other half of their participants to hold it like in between their nose and their lips, so like this. So when you do that, you make kind of a frowny face, right? It sort of forces you to like frown almost like you're sad. So they had participants do one of those two things. And then simultaneously, they were like filling out some sort of questionnaire basically about like their emotional state. And they found the ones who held the pencil in their teeth tended to score higher on happiness, and the ones who hold it like between their nose and their lip tended to score higher on the sadness part of the emotional scale. So just like forcing people to make a silly, gesture with their face basically influenced the actual emotion that they felt. So we tend to, like our intuitive experience, it feels like these things all happen simultaneously, right? It feels like if a snake came in the room and I felt scared, everything's going to happen all at once. My heart rate's going to go up. I'm going to feel fear. I'm going to make a facial expression. But there is some evidence that depending on the circumstance, they actually do happen like in a particular order, not always simultaneously.